It's the Opperman Report. Join digital forensic investigator and PI Ed Opperman for an in-depth discussion of conspiracy theories, strategy of New World Order resistance, high-profile court cases in the news, and interviews with expert guests and authors on these topics and more. It's the Opperman Report. And now, here is investigator Ed Opperman.
Okay, welcome to the Opperman Report. I am your host, private investigator Ed Opperman, and this show is brought to you by Audible.com. You go to audibletrial.com/Opperman Report. You sign up for free, get yourself a free audiobook, and it helps support the show. Okay, tonight we are live on TalkStreamLive.com, PSN Radio, Wolf Spirit Radio, TalkSuperstation.com, Awake Radio US, Awake Radio UK, 1800 online, ShizazRadio.com, Just Us Radio Network, and Scottish Sovereigns on the Land. And then the show will be replayed Saturday morning, Talk Superstation. Para X Radio, CBS Radio, Saturday nights, 7 p.m. Penny Entertainment, Sunday mornings, 10 a.m. Eastern Time. Firehorse Radio, Wednesday nights. Late Night in the Midlands on Tuesday afternoons at 4 p.m. Good old Mike Vara. High Point Radio, both AM and FM, covering New Jersey, New York, and Pennsylvania. FPRN Radio, 5 days a week, Monday to Friday, 10 a.m. every day. And Cave Radio broadcasting twice a week. Tonight, a show I've been really looking forward to. And it's about the murder of Marilyn Monroe. And we have had a huge response to the promos to this show. It's about a book called The Murder of Marilyn Monroe, Case Closed. The authors are J. Margolis and Richard Buskin. I'm going to have them introduce themselves and tell us about themselves. Jay and Richard, can you hear me?
Yeah, sure, I can hear you. This is Jay Margolis, and I'm a Jesse Unruh Research Scholar, and I graduated from the University of Southern California with a 3.91 grade point average. I've always had an inclination for research, and so apparently during this time I'm studying famous unsolved murders, and two of the ones I focused on in this book were the murder of Marilyn Monroe and then a 19-page chapter on the murder of Bobby Kennedy.
Very good. How about you, Richard?
Okay, so Richard Buskin. I'm originally from London, England, now based in Chicago. New York Times best-selling author. I've written over 30 books, all non-fiction. A lot of them biographies, celebrity biographies, as well as autobiographies. I did do a book on Marilyn back in 2002 called Blonde Heat, the sizzling screen career of Marilyn Monroe, focused on the film career. And during the course of that project, people would always ask me about, what my theory was about how Marilyn died. And over the years, a number of people wanted to get involved with me about, to do a book about that subject. And it wasn't until Jay, basically contacted me and done this stunning research. It was really, blew me away, and it was so compelling that I decided to get involved.
Yeah, I've been very impressed with the research too, Jay. Because I've been trying to find a guest on this topic for various reasons. But before we get into the whole murder versus suicide, and then who do you think did it, and how do you think it happened? Why don't we have a big audience all over Scotland and Ireland. I get emails from everywhere. You won't believe it. And a lot of these people, they're young, and I'm sure they don't know who Marilyn Monroe was. Some of them don't even know who JFK was or RFK. Believe it or not. My own daughter's 14 years old. She hardly knows. So why don't you tell us about, guys, the career of Marilyn Monroe and why she's such an icon? What's the big deal about Marilyn Monroe?
Okay, if I can take that first.
Sure.
In terms, as an actress, not only did she work with many of the top people of her era, top actors, directors, producers and writers, there was a reason for that. It wasn't just because she was beautiful and, created this sort of dumb blonde persona. She actually, I think, was a very talented comedian. She had natural comic timing on screen. And the thing that was really fascinating about Marilyn when I interviewed her fellow actors they said that when they were working with her on the set of the film, she would appear as if she had no technique. She would go up on her lines, she'd, miss her cues, she'd miss the key light, and seemed as if she didn't know what she was doing. And yet, when they saw the results on screen, they were just remarkable. And I had one person after another tell me the same thing. They didn't know that other people had been telling me this. They would all say the same. And finally, I asked Jack Lemmon, who co-starred with her in Some Like It Hard. I said, what was it? I mean, I don't believe this word that it's just magic. What was that magic? And he said that in his experience as an actor, normally on a hot take, like the best take, an actor gets out maybe 80% of his talent on screen. And he said with Marilyn, when it was the hot take, she would get most likely 100% on celluloid. And he said that's the only actor he'd ever known who was capable of doing that. And you add to that the fact that she was a natural model. She just made love to the camera. And, there you have the Monroe magic. Adding to that is, when she died, I think, a lot of men would fantasize about, maybe they could have saved her. Maybe, if I was with Marilyn, I could have somehow kept her in this world. With women, I think they also not only saw how beautiful Marilyn was, but they admired her as an independent woman. This was a woman ahead of her time. It was a time when men still ran Hollywood. And Marilyn went against the studio system and ended up basically forming her own production company and making her own demands in terms of the scripts that she was given. And, there's a lot to admire in her, and she was only 36 years old when she died. So the potential still wasn't fulfilled.
And you talk about her acting. She had a real acting. Lee Strasberg was a big deal back in those days.
Absolutely. It was not just Lee Strasberg. I mean, she actually worked with a number of top drama coaches right through her career. And that's another thing. You see, the screen persona, people might think she was this dumb blonde. She was far from that. If you see her in interviews, she was much more quietly spoken, and she studied her craft right from the get-go. She could sing, she could dance, she could do it all, really. And that was the thing. She created the Marilyn Monroe persona. It made her a superstar. But once she became that superstar, she felt trapped by that image. And, of course, the studio, 20th Century Fox, they didn't want to mess with that formula. And that was the struggle. She wanted to break free from that and show that she could be a serious actress. And she did indeed do that in the second half of her career.
Now, the early life of Marilyn Monroe, she was like in an orphanage, right? Like a foster child. Her mother was in a mental institution, stuff like that. How did she get from there to being in the seat of power with the Kennedys and Sinatra and all these?
Well, she had this best friend of her mother named Grace Goddard, and she just really hammered in her this idea that she could, be like the movie stars that she'd take her to the theaters. And so that, from a very early age, became a dream of hers, which she has discussed to Aunt Anna Lauer, who was the aunt of Grace Goddard. And there was no family involvement, with Aunt Anna, but Aunt Anna Lauer became a very strong influence in Marilyn's life. She said that Aunt Anna was the only person that she really loved because she knew that childhood dream of hers could become a reality, and nobody else was paying attention to her. People at school, until she was Marilyn was 12 or 13 years old, nobody would pay attention to her. They make fun of her. They'd call her Norma Jean, the string bean. Mm-hmm. So there was all this, all these things stopping her from realizing her dream, but she just kept pushing. And the people who realize their dreams, they keep pushing until they actually make it, and that's what she did. And she became Marilyn Monroe.
I mean, also, we always hear about Marilyn's neuroses, the fact that she was late on the set and sometimes was difficult, to work with, certainly from a director standpoint. But if you consider that I can't remember the statistic. I mean, Jay may correct me on this, but I think it was something like she was in 13 foster homes by the age of 11. And so she had a really rough start, you know, and that makes her story all the more remarkable. That's where she came from. She had a mother who was in and out of mental institutions. She, all her life, was in fear that she would follow in her footsteps. And yet, look what she made of herself.
Amazing. I didn't know about the 14 foster homes. So how did she get from there to Hollywood?
She actually was in Hollywood. Her mother was a film cutter at RKO Studios.
Oh, okay.
And so Marilyn actually grew up in that environment, and at a very early age, because she never at that time knew who her father was, and she would fantasize that Clark Gable was her dad. And, you know, it came full circle, because the last film that she and Clark Gable actually completed was The Misfits in 1961, so they actually got to work together.
Okay, that's remarkable. I didn't know that. Okay, and now then how was she able to afford it? I know she had some plastic surgery early on, too, and acting classes. And so how did she afford all of that? Well,
in terms of, again, she was acting. I mean, she basically made it onto the screen the first time in 1947, and she was getting bit parts. She had 2 6-month contracts with 20th Century Fox in 47 and 48, then didn't get renewed, and was working, you know, for other studios, doing some stuff for Columbia and MGM, bit parts. So she was a struggling actress. But early on, she did make some high-powered contacts. One of them was Johnny Hyde, who was a kind of Hollywood super agent, and another one was Joseph Schenck, who was the president of 20th Century Fox. So she had some, you know, major players backing her, and it was actually through Johnny Hyde that she eventually got the contract with Fox and started earning decent money, and it was with that money that she could afford to pay for the plastic surgery.
Gotcha. Okay.
I also wanted to add that Marilyn eventually realized that Charles Stanley Gifford, who was one of the cutters working with her mother, was actually her father. And, you know, his minister, Donald Lydon, before his death, said that, yes, Charles Stanley Gifford said, I was the, you know, father of Marilyn Monroe. And so that became a really big deal, you know, because there's confirmation to his own minister before he dies.
And Jay, I'm going to ask you, did she not try and get in touch with Stanley Gifford?
Oh, she did. And in fact, you know, there was a situation where he says, you know, I have a family now, and this could really, you know, make my wife feel bad, my current wife. And so he didn't really want to, you know, touch it with a 10-foot pole at that time, because he didn't want to supposedly bring shame on his family. But there was an opportunity where he actually called her later in her career, about a year before her own death, and he wanted to get in touch, and then she just said, you know, talk to my lawyer.
You know what, guys? That's not unusual. I do a lot of locates, you know, adoption, relocations, reunifications, or kids who want to find their long-lost father, their long-lost mother. And usually with women, they'll find their father, their long-lost relative, and they'll meet with them once, and that's it. And men will find them, just find them, and never contact them.
Wow. Yes, you know, Marilyn made a couple tries. You know, Jim Doherty, her first husband, said that in his presence she made a phone call to Hemet, because, you know, her father had a dairy farm over in Hemet. And so, you know, at that time he was not receptive at all. And, he could see that she was really broken up about that. And her drama coach, Natasha Lytess, can also attest to a time when they actually drove all the way out to Palm Springs. And then she made a call, and then he just, you know, was not receptive to her at that time. It's very sad.
Yeah, and this is great, detailed information. A lot of stuff I've never heard before. This is excellent. Now, I love details, you know. Now, okay, so now she becomes this huge star, right? And she hooks up with guys like Joe DiMaggio. She marries Joe DiMaggio, you know, one of the, some people still say that
biggest baseball player of all time.
Yeah, you know. Yeah. I ran into him once at one of the Tyson fights in the 80s, and he's larger than life, you know, even in his 70s, you know.
Yeah.
So now, before DiMaggio, were there some suicide attempts before her big stardom?
Yes, Natasha Lytess, when after she got dropped from Columbia after Ladies of the Chorus,
which was in 1948.
Right, 1948, and Natasha Lytess found her with a bunch of Nebutol pills in her mouth and said, "What have you done?" And Marilyn is just like, "Well, I can't go on if I can't act," and so she felt very dejected after that rejection by Columbia. But Natasha convinced her, look, you just got to continue and keep going, and you'll make it if you try really hard, and so Natasha can attest that Marilyn had nothing but records and books, and so she didn't even have money to buy like a full wardrobe. She would just spend it on books and, things to better her mind as opposed to just her appearance.
It's interesting you say that as well, because when she was a bit part actress, often those people would have to supply their own wardrobe. And so I know there's one particular sweater that Marilyn wore, is like grey and black, and there are photos of her in 4 different films where she's wearing exactly the same sweater. I mean, she really struggled to make ends meet at the beginning.
Oh, exactly. She would borrow it from the actual studio wardrobe.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what happened there.
Did she also do some nude modeling?
Well, it was always very, it wasn't tasteless, okay? She did the calendar, which became famous, but she asked Tom Kelly, the photographer who was present with, his wife, she said, "Your wife must be present during these shots," Natalie Kelly. And she just basically told Tom Kelly, "Look, this isn't going to go anywhere, is it? I don't want to be recognized." This was before, stardom. And so he paid her $50 so that she could, just make ends meet. I mean, she's at the studio club. They give her some meals there, but it's just some boarding while she can, make her way.
And in fact, that was 1949, so $50 then was actually a fair amount of money for her. That calendar shoots kind of came and went. It was when she became a star that it suddenly got revived, and suddenly it was like, well, there are these new shots of Marilyn. So that's when it really became kind of national news.
It definitely propelled her as a movie actress. It helped tremendously. It was like publicity that nobody could buy. I mean, for $50, come on, that was worth it.
Yeah.
And that photo ended up being she ended up being the first centerfold in Playboy magazine, the first issue of Playboy in 1953, and the magazine sold out.
That's why Hugh Hefner, bought a crypt that's going to ensure that he's next to Marilyn, because he wants to thank her for, all the sales that she made for him.
Yes.
So very interesting. So she was there involved in that whole Playboy Hugh Hefner crowd as well, huh?
Yeah. If you you can look online, you'll see the very first issue of Playboy in 1953. Marilyn's on the cover, and then the nude calendar shot from 4 years earlier was the centerfold.
Okay, so here we have this woman, immensely talented, charismatic, has a way about her that so many beautiful women today look up to and admire and identify with in such a way that, like, no other woman in history, really, that sticks out. Let's hear about what then began the downfall.
Well, the studios, what they would do is they would supply, prescription pills right at the front counter, to keep you going, keep you up during the day, and then to, put you to sleep during the night. And she just apparently got addicted, which was not unusual. You see, in today's culture, they try to make it seem like, oh, she's a drug addict, but you have to put it in the context of its time. If it was today, that would be a different situation. Studios don't provide that type of stuff like they used to. And so now,
they did that earlier on. MGM did that earlier on with Judy Garland. Same thing. That she overworking her, and to keep her going, they put her on amphetamines, and she became hooked. It became a lifelong habit.
Yeah, and she was a child when they started her on that stuff.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So
and you even look at Elvis Presley.
Yeah.
Where did his drug habit start? In the army. In the U.S. Army, and when he did his national service for 2 years, and there were night maneuvers, they would give them uppers, and that started his drug habit. So Marilyn, as Jay said, the same kind of thing, got hooked on them early on, and then later on in life, she would be, washing down the sleeping pills with glasses of Dom Perignon champagne.
She would even prick open the pill in order to make it, work faster.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's bad. Yeah. Okay, so then then she starts getting hooked up like with the Kennedys and Sinatra
Yes.
and those guys. Yeah, and Peter
That
Lawford.
is true. According to Marilyn's hairstylist, Sidney Guleroff, who knew her since the Asphalt Jungle in 1950, Sidney said that Marilyn told Marilyn told Sidney on the last day of her life, she stated to Sidney that she was having an affair with JFK, and then she had an affair with Bobby Kennedy, and then everything had gone wrong. And so, she's crying because she says that Bobby Kennedy and Peter Lawford just left her house, and this was the last day of her life, about 2 p.m., and they, went empty-handed without her red diary, and where she documented her affairs with Bobby Kennedy and Jack Kennedy. So you can imagine that Bobby wants to get rid of that diary. And so that's why he's in Los Angeles on a secret trip, pretending like he never left John Bates's ranch in San Francisco over in Gilroy. Now, the whole thing is that, there's a lot of people who doubt that there's an affair with Bobby Kennedy, but I absolutely trust Sidney Guleroff. He would never lie, and that is something that is very strong. Just like Ralph Roberts, who was her masseur, said there was an affair with Jack Kennedy. He said there was a time, March 24th to March 26th, at Bing Crosby's house in Palm Springs, JFK and Marilyn had a tryst, and Ralph Roberts, her masseur and best friend, said, yes, that absolutely happened. And Ralph said that Marilyn called him and said, hey, I need some advice on some back muscles because my friend here needs some advice. And so then Marilyn put JFK on the phone with Ralph Roberts, her best friend and masseur, and said, here, talk to my friend and give him some advice. And so Ralph Roberts started to hear that famous Bostonian accent, and he was a little startled, but he, finished the conversation, which was about a few more minutes, and he hung up. But I think Marilyn just wanted to let him know that there was something there, and she later told him about it. And that account has never been doubted by any Marilyn biographer.
There have also been some people who allege that the affair with Jack Kennedy started long before he was president. There was one time in the early 50s when he was hospitalized with his back problem, and someone who visited him said there was a photo of Marilyn on his bedside table in his hospital room. So, there's every chance that she was around the Kennedys for much longer than people realize.
Exactly. In fact, there's Arthur James, who in the mid-1950s at the Malibu cottage, he actually saw Marilyn and JFK together. So it's very clear that they met years before that, and before he even became president.
Very interesting. Now, but also, she was also involved with some organized crime guys as well?
When you say involved, I would never suggest sexually. You must mean like, was she friends with people like Sam Giancana?
Yeah.
She was acquainted with Sam Giancana, but she was not sexually acquainted with him.
Okay, but now also too, she was under FBI surveillance, and also they found many. Her phones and her home were wiretapped.
That is correct.
Okay.
The FBI has been surveillancing her, ever since the mid-1950s, especially during the time of Bus Stop. And her house was surveillanced by Fred Otash. You see, he contacted Bernard Spindell, a famous expert wiretapper, and Bernard Spindell said, look, Jimmy Hoffa wants to get a derogatory profile on Bobby Kennedy, on Jack Kennedy. What could we do? And Fred Otash says, okay, I'll go to the Lawford house. I'll go to Marilyn's house. We'll bug them. And there were bugs on the phones. There were bugs in the bedrooms. And they picked up all the sounds. And Fred Otash said that they would be activated when the Kennedy boys were in town. And sure enough, it picked up, an affair with Jack Kennedy and then Bobby Kennedy. And Fred Otash said that there were more tapes made on Marilyn and Bobby making love than there were on Jack and Marilyn making love.
Also, I've seen, under the Freedom of Information Act in the last few years, certain documents from the FBI files on Marilyn have been released. And I've seen some of those documents. And, there were documents from the early 60s when Marilyn was associating with people who the feds, perceived as sort of rabid communists.
Right.
And they were actually tracking her. I've seen these documents, and they were initialed by J. Edgar Hoover. So he was fully aware of all this. And it's kind of scary, because in these documents they're sort of saying, she was seen going into this hotel with this guy, at this time on this day, and then this time she emerged from the hotel. I saw another document where she was at a party with Bobby Kennedy, and this was brought to the attention of J. Edgar Hoover. And in that document it says that she was, that Bobby was overheard divulging certain state secrets about the Cuban Missile Crisis to Marilyn. And so that they were not only disturbed about, what the Attorney General of the United States was giving away, but also that, what information was Marilyn Monroe carrying with her.
This is just so fascinating. This woman who can come from 14 foster homes, she's being spied on by the FBI because she's hanging out with communists and alleged communists like Miller and stuff like that. The mafia was spying on her for Jimmy Hoffa. And she's being told secrets by RFK about the Cuban Missile Crisis. It's just you couldn't make this up.
And what I say to people, imagine if today one of the sort of superstars of the present day, let's say it was Angelina Jolie, was having an affair with the President of the United States and his brother, who's the Attorney General. It's just mind-blowing. Yeah. It's absolutely mind-blowing.
It really is. It really is. But I think some of that stuff still does go on today, because when you look at the Clinton story, with Monica Lewinsky and stuff, he had some famous people were coming over there. I don't know if I want to mention their names, but I think it's pretty much out there. Mondale's daughter, was going over to visit him as well,
Right.
It's
and so it continues.
It continues, yeah. But JFK, too, he had some kind of stuff going on with interns at the White House, didn't he?
Oh, definitely. A 19-year-old intern, Mimi Alford, that's been written into a book, and I absolutely believe it's credible.
Yeah, just amazing.
Yeah, I mean, he Angie Dickinson, the actress, she was a regular visitor to the White House. JFK wasn't subtle about this stuff, It's just that in those days, the press basically wouldn't, reveal all of this. A lot of people just kept quiet. They thought it was in the best interests of the country not to divulge this in the newspapers and on TV and radio. Also, it was the pre-internet era.
Right.
Now I don't think you could contain that information. But back then, they kept it quiet. I'm not so sure if JFK had lived and, seen that second term in the White House, maybe some of this would have come to light. But he basically got away with it during his lifetime.
That is very true. In fact, I interviewed Jane Mansfield's press secretary, Raymond Straight, and he was her press secretary for the last 10 years of her life. And he said that Peter Lawford showed him a tape, an actual bugging tape, of the president making love with Jane Mansfield. And so he knew that Peter Lawford had a bunch of these audio tapes of his own collection capturing, trysts with his brother-in-law, JFK, and also Bobby, with famous superstars like Jane Mansfield. And then Jane, actually was shown this tape of her making love with the president. She thought it was hysterical. And so, Raymond Straight told me the next time Jane wanted Peter to show the tape again to somebody else, and he declined. But, what Rusty got out of it was that he said that apparently Lawford had quite a library of these trysts on record.
Okay, we're going to have to take a break, but when we get back,
oh, sure.
I want to ask you, do you think he had this for his own personal enjoyment, or was he into blackmail or something as well?
Well, I guess that's all speculation, but it's interesting that he had it in his possession, that's for sure.
It sure is. Oh, my God. Okay, we are here with Jay Margolis and Richard Buskin. They're the co-authors of Murder of Marilyn Monroe, Case Closed. Got a link to the book. If you go to the Opperman Report blog, There's a link there. You can pick it up on Amazon and just leaf through it. Just the fascinating. And there's also, too, a connection to the RFK murder and Sirhan and all that kind of stuff, the polka-dot dress woman. So let's see where all this is going to go. This is just fascinating information, just unbelievable when you think about it. We'll be right back after these messages, more with Jay Margolis and Richard Buskin. And now a word from our sponsors. We are listener-sponsored, and we appreciate your donations. If you like the show, please visit OppermanReport.com and click on the donate button. Or you can donate directly through PayPal at OppermanReport@gmail.com. We have Mike Ray of InfinityHomePlans.com. He's the host of Parlay over at CJ Mars Radio, Thursday evenings, 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you need custom home designs, stock plans, or 3D work, he's your one-stop shop for home design and drafting needs. Mike Gray at InfinityHomePlans.com. At InfinityHomePlans.com. If you're looking for essential oils, stop by and check out Essentially Tammy on Facebook. She is Young Living Essential Oils Independent Distributor. Now, these are 100% therapeutic grade oils. They help support the body's natural functions. You can visit her website posted on Essentially Tammy to see the current deals, or email at JockoTammy, JOCATAMI @yahoo.com, or call 352-239-8546. 352-239-8546. Hey, if you need a private investigator, go to my website, emailrevealer.com. We offer asset searches, locates, skip tracing, adoption investigations, online infidelity investigations. We can recover deleted text messages from a cell phone or trace an email to online dating websites to catch people cheating. That's emailrevealer.com, or you can call 800-572-9762. 800-572-9762 for emailrevealer.com, my PI website. Pacific West Bamboo. It's your premier source for construction and craft-grade bamboo poles. They're announcing their latest project with EcoHead Event Sanitation, making bamboo composting bathrooms and porta-potties. Their first display will be at the Lucidity Festival in Santa Ynez, California, April 11th to the 13th. Come by and say hi and see what you can build with bamboo. Contact them for any kind of event planning, display building. If you need construction-grade or craft-grade bamboo products, call Amanda at 503-839-8126, 503-839-8126, or visit PacificWestBamboo.com, their brand new website. We're also sponsored by the New World Mexican Women. This is a rural Mexican craft women's cooperative. They are traditional makers of fine handcrafted, authentic jewelry. They use beautiful stone mosaics and Pacific blue Abilene inlay. They have a wonderful book of love letters written to their men in the United States, begging them to return to their families in Mexico. But they've written a new book, and it's it's about a young girl that falls in love with a rodeo bull rider and runs off with him without telling her family. It's a beautiful love story called Azuquina Part 1, Azuquina to the Rodeo. You can find their books and jewelry by clicking on their banner ad at OppermanReport.com or by Googling New World Mexican Women. You can also promote your business or website right here and have your ad played all over the world 7 days a week by emailing OppermanReport@gmail.com or calling 800-572-9762. Okay, welcome back to the Opperman Report. I'm your host, Private Investigator Ed Opperman. Show is brought to you by Audible.com. Go to audibletrial.com/Opperman Report. Get yourself a free audio book and help support the show. We need that, you know it. We're here tonight with Jay Margolis and Richard Buskin. They're the authors of Murder of Marilyn Monroe, Case Closed. And then there's a link available to that book on the Opperman Report blog. You can go there and pick it up tonight. We were just talking about she was also, by the way, under surveillance by the CIA as well?
That is correct. There's even a CIA document dated August 3rd, 1962, which is one day before she's murdered by Ralph Greenson, and in which the document, it says that they're very aware that she is going to hold a quote-unquote tell-all press conference, and they're also aware of what they call her quote-unquote diary of secrets, in which she documented the plot to kill Castro, which is something that's a national security threat. Nobody's supposed to know what the government is doing, when the public's not supposed to know about that.
Now, I would assume that they heard about her announcement that she was going to hold this press conference because Sam Giancana was at the Cal.
Not about Sam Giancana. It's about exposing the Kennedy brothers and her affairs with them. It had nothing to do with the mafia.
Oh, no, but I'm saying because she had that breakdown at Cal Neva, right?
Cal Neva Lodge,
Right.
July 27th to July 29th. Yes, there was a problem there. She was molested by gangsters Johnny Roselli and Skinny D'Amato, in which Joe DiMaggio did not forgive Skinny for about 20 years after that, and I'm surprised that he forgave him then. But he knew that he was responsible for that. But Sam Giancana had nothing to do with that.
Oh, no, but he was present there, though, right?
He was present, yes, that weekend he was.
Okay.
So was Frank Sinatra,
Buddy Greco.
Right.
Yeah.
Who took those last pictures? They're not the last. They're not the last professional picture. That goes to George Barris on July 13th, 1962. But they're the last candid, personal pictures, if you will, of Marilyn Monroe at the Cal Neva.
Okay, I've never heard that story. Tell us what happened at Cal Neva. Tell us what happened that weekend.
Well, she was invited by Frank Sinatra. He thought that maybe this would, be something good for her just to come over to his resort for the weekend. And, of course, Joe DiMaggio was, he found out that she was going there, so he showed up. And there was some friction between Frank and Joe. And during the time, Marilyn was fed these pills by D'Amato and Roselli, and they took advantage of her. And, Frank, all he saw was the fact that she was drugged up. He didn't know how. And so he just basically said, get her out of here. And there were people taking her under each arm out of the Cal Neva. There were witnesses that saw that.
Yeah, and isn't that when she was yelling, hey, I'm going to, blow the lid off everything?
She was going to say that, yes, I'm going to expose the Kennedy brothers. She did say that when she was in her... in that state, she was not in control of her faculties.
Yeah, and Joe DiMaggio never forgave, Sinatra for that and for what went on that weekend, because the word got back to him. And, that's why when Marilyn died, none of them were invited to the funeral. Joe took charge of the funeral, and he made sure none of them went anywhere near it.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I think it was only like 25 people who came to the funeral, right?
About 30.
Oh, about 30 people. Okay, and none of those Rat Pack, Camelot people, none of those people came?
None of them were allowed. In fact, it's very sad because even Ella Fitzgerald was turned down. That's really sad. She was a very close friend of Marilyn's.
Okay, that's interesting. I had never heard any of that before. I never knew she was like raped over there at the Cal Neva.
Yeah.
It's a very sad event. I'm sure that... I'm very surprised that Joe DiMaggio forgave Skinny D'Amato for that. That, to me, is surprising.
Let me ask you guys a question, because now Geraldo Rivera was supposed to do a story about Marilyn Monroe and his connection to the Kennedys, right? Are you guys familiar with that?
I've heard about it.
Yeah.
Do you know what was in that report?
No, I don't.
No, I don't.
If it has anything to do with the mafia murdering Marilyn, that's absolutely false.
No,
that's a very popular alternate argument to the Kennedy involvement.
Yeah, I don't think it is. I know that he had this report that he was going to do about Marilyn Monroe and her connections to the Kennedys, and I think even about her death as well. And the story was silenced by ABC 2020. They wouldn't put it on. And
2020, maybe it's with Sylvia Chase, where Fred Otash was being interviewed, and in that interview, which was suppressed, I believe this is what you're talking about.
Okay, go ahead.
And in the interview, Sylvia Chase is asking Fred Otash, he said, "You heard these bugging tapes?" And Fred says, "Yeah, they were running the day of her death." And so he says, "Well, what is Fred Otash saying about it?" And so Fred Otash said that he heard Bobby Kennedy have a violent argument with Marilyn Monroe, and because, he had allegedly promised to leave Ethel and marry her. And so even though Marilyn, didn't actually think that was going to happen, she's just mad that he didn't keep his promise, so she's sticking it to him. And so this happened just before she's murdered. I mean, just literally less than a couple hours before she's murdered, they're having this argument, and it's just unbelievable. This is during the nighttime, and Robert Kennedy is present with these two police officers, Archie Case and James Ahern. And Fred Otash said in his notes that during that evening, when he's present with these two cops, Marilyn is just screaming at Bobby and saying, "You promised to marry me," and everything. And so at this time, Bobby's very worried about all the noise she's causing to the neighbors. So the two cops, they strong-arm Marilyn, and they throw her on the bed, and Bobby puts a pillow over her face to keep her quiet. This is approximately just before 10 o'clock on the last evening of her life. And so Bobby's overheard on wiretap saying, "Give her something to calm her down." And so at this time, Archie Case and James Ahern, they take a needle out of their medical bag, and they give her Nebutol injections into the jugular vein in her neck and behind both knees. In fact, one of those two cops gave her an injection into the left armpit earlier in the afternoon. And this is documented in our book. And so what they're trying to do is they're just trying to make her not be so hysterical. And when that didn't work, Bobby told them to give her a drug-laced enema full of 17 chlorohydrates, broken down pills, and 13 to 19 Nebutols. Now, this did not kill her. It just knocked her out. She was unconscious. And at that time, Marilyn's handyman, Norman Jeffries, who was also Mrs. Murray, the housekeeper's son-in-law, said that they were kicked out, So at this time, when all this is happening, they were kicked out by Bobby Kennedy and the two cops. They waited at a neighbor's house at 12304 Fifth Helena Drive, the home of Mary W. Goody Coons Barnes. Our book is the first book to actually name her because she died in 1964. She did not identify herself to the first officer at the scene, Sergeant Jack Clemens, but she did tell him, she said, quote, "I've seen Bobby Kennedy go into that house a dozen times. That definitely was him. I don't know who the other two men were," end quote. And so we know it's Mrs. Barnes because the psychiatrist's daughter, Ralph Greenson's daughter, Joan Greenson, said in her sealed-off manuscript until January 1st, 2039, it's sealed by the Greenson family from the public, but we had access to it. And she states in there, she says, Marilyn found out that the neighbor who you could see from her property was a professor at the university. That was the clue that led us to Professor Ralph Mosser Barnes, and his wife was Mary W. Goody Coons Barnes.
Okay, how did she? What was her cause of death? Goody Two Barnes. How did she die? What did she die of?
Mrs. Mary W. Goody Coons Barnes. She's the one that told Sergeant Jack Clemens. She says, "I've seen Bobby Kennedy go in that house a dozen times. That definitely was him. I don't know who the other two men were." And so this is the same observation that Norman Jeffries, the handyman, told Donald Wolfe. And he said that he saw Bobby Kennedy and two men kick him out of the house. And so Jeffries said they went to a neighbor's house. This was at Mrs. Barnes's house, who also saw the same thing that Jeffries did. And so they waited like 20 minutes while, Bobby Kennedy and these two cops are dealing with the guest cottage, trying to get the red diary. And Marilyn comes over. She puts the phone down because she's talking to Jose Bolaños, the Mexican screenwriter she took to the Golden Globe Awards in March 1962. She's on the phone about 9:45 p.m., and she says, "Hold on a minute, I hear a noise from the guest cottage." So Bolaños told Anthony Summers that she just put down the phone but never came back on the line. And so that makes sense because when she walks over to the guest cottage, that's when Bobby subdues her. That's when she gets the Nebutol injections. And then Bobby says, well, you better, give her this enema. That knocks her out. They look for the diary some more. They never find it that night because Mrs. Murray took possession of it to protect Marilyn's personal belongings. And at that point, the men leave. So once they're gone, Jeffries and Mrs. Murray come back from Mrs. Barnes's house. They notice that the dog is barking, Maff, her Maltese
Wait, but
terrier.
before you get too far, though, Jay.
And what's happening is that they notice they find their employer slumped over the bed. So Mrs. Murray takes the phone from Marilyn and calls an ambulance. And that's when the ambulance gets involved in this story.
Yeah, but before you get too far, you mentioned that Mrs. Barnes died 2 years later in '64.
Right.
What did she die
so
from?
when she told this to Sergeant Jack Clemens, it was just days after Marilyn's death when Sergeant Clemens was interviewing the neighbors. And
Sergeant
so that
Clemens
was in 1962.
Sergeant Clemens was the first LAPD police officer on the scene.
But do we know what Mrs. Barnes died from 2 years later?
I'm not sure, but she was approximately, she was born in 1900, died in 1964. It makes her about 64 years old.
Okay.
I am not sure what she died of.
Okay, it just jumped out at me. I want to hear that. Oh, boy. Okay.
And the most important part of this whole thing is that an ambulance was called. There are a lot of people who say, oh, there was no ambulance. They'd have to talk to the 14 Schaefer ambulance attendants who actually remember that call. Before our book came out, there were only 8 documented attendants who remember it. We add 6 attendants to that account.
Okay, so now where we are right now is Bobby Kennedy shows up with a couple of thug cops with him, his local cops, right?
Yes, Archie Case and James Ahern were the first Maryland book to actually name them.
Okay, and they shoot her up with some drugs. Now, these needle marks, do they show up in the autopsy?
Initially, Noguchi, what he did was that days after the autopsy...
Thomas Noguchi, he was the pathologist on the case.
And that's the guy that they based Quincy after. The TV show Quincy is based on Noguchi.
Right. So what Dr. Thomas Noguchi did was that he initially notated there were needle marks under the left armpit, there were needle marks in the jugular vein in her neck, and then behind both knees. And he never notated one in the heart because he probably figured, well, that kind of gives the whole case away because there were several rumors that Bobby Kennedy had Marilyn done away with. I spoke with Peter Lawford's best friend, Joseph Nahr, who was a TV producer. He passed away recently. But he told me something very important about what people were thinking back then. He said that Warren Beatty was going around saying that Bobby Kennedy had Marilyn killed, and that was the talk that he was hearing during that time, and he told me that on a recording. He said that there were several people in the movie industry, including Warren Beatty, who were saying, hey, it looks like Bobby Kennedy had Marilyn taken care of. This was before Warren Beatty was friends with the Kennedys. And then apparently they probably just, talked to him a little bit. But before that happened, he was really talking about that all over Hollywood, according to Joe Nahr.
Now, wasn't Peter Lawford there on the scene, too, that day?
Oh, yes, definitely. He was there, and in fact, when Marilyn called Sidney Guliroff, Marilyn's hairstylist, she was crying, and so he says, what happened? And Marilyn says, oh, Bobby Kennedy and Peter Lawford just left my house. And this is the last afternoon of her life. A few hours later, she's dead.
And that's interesting, too, now, because wasn't she supposed to go to... She was invited to Peter Lawford's house for dinner that night.
That's just a cover story. That is just, the stuff that they want you to think. So, see, the official story that the Kennedys love to promote is that Peter Lawford immediately got on the phone with Marilyn, and she says, oh, I'm too tired. I think I'm just going to stay here. And it's just baloney. That's a baloney story.
Okay, because the impression I had gotten was that perhaps Peter Lawford was luring her over to his place where they could do the job there. No?
No.
Okay.
She was in the guest cottage when she died, and that was when Bobby Kennedy was not there when she was murdered, but he was there to knock her out with that drug enema, and then he wanted to make sure that he left the house right after that, and that's what he did. And the housekeeper and the handyman came back, saw Marilyn in distress, unconscious. They did the right thing. They called an ambulance. And at that time, Bobby Kennedy was not there.
They found her in the guest house, or they found her in her bedroom?
In the guest house, because she walked over to investigate the noise. She was initially in her main bedroom when Jeffries and Murray, had left the house when they were kicked out by Bobby and the two men.
Gotcha.
But, then Marilyn herself walked over to the guest cottage because she was investigating that noise. Gotcha. And that's when she ran into Bobby Kennedy, and they subdued her, and they made her unconscious.
Okay, so then the housekeeper, her son, return. They find their...
The son-in-law returns, and they call Schaefer Ambulance. There are 14 attendants who remember this call, and Edgardo Villalobos told me in a first-time interview, he said that he remembers the call, and he said that the people who got the call were James Hall and Murray Leibowitz. And those were the two attendants, he said, responded because Edgardo Villalobos says, that he got the first call, but he was too far away. He and his partner, Larry Telling, they couldn't have gone to Marilyn's house from Beverly and Western to Brentwood. If they had gone 100 miles an hour, they'd never make it. And so, Edgardo Villalobos said, James Hall and Murray Leibowitz, they were in Santa Monica, and they were right around the corner. They were able to respond very quickly. And so this is where the story takes off, is that the attendants, they arrive, Hall and Leibowitz, they arrive at Marilyn's house. They see that she's, in distress. They were led into the guest bedroom by Pat Newcomb, her publicist, who claims that she wasn't even on the scene at this time. Hall says that Pat Newcomb was screaming, she's dead, in there, I think she's dead. And James Hall is trying to figure out what happened so he can respond the best way he can. He says, what's wrong with her? And Pat Newcomb says, I think she took some pills. And so, James Hall smells her mouth. He notices there's no odor repair. There's no odor of drugs. That means that the chloral hydrate did not orally enter her system. And it couldn't have been injected because then she'd be dead before the ambulance got there. The only way it could have gotten in there was the drug enema, which, Kennedy and the two cops gave her. And so,
let me stop you there, Jay.
He thought it was really strange that here's a woman who's a purported overdose. There's no smell of the drugs near her mouth.
Jay, but if you administer an enema, there's fecal matter that comes out, the stains on the mattress, the stains on the pillow, on the sheets.
Exactly, and that's why Sergeant Clemens said that Mrs. Murray was washing the sheets. In fact, James Hall said that all the sheets were removed when he got there. He said that there was no sheet, there was no blanket, so presumably it had been removed because it was all soiled. And so see what happened was that she was leaning downwards, face down. Marilyn was face down when Murray and Norman Jeffries found her. But when James Hall and Murray Leibowitz got there, she was face up. So somebody moved her from face down to face up between the time that Mrs. Murray called the ambulance and the time that the ambulance actually showed up.
And there was a reason for having her face down and face up, right, Jay?
Yes, definitely. But, that actually is more relevant to after her death because they faced her down in order to make the post-mortem lividity, go to the front of her body. In fact, Noguchi, in his own official autopsy report, he notices there's lividity in her face and also in her chest, which would disguise a needle mark in her chest by Ralph Greenson. And see, this is where the ambulance attendants are trying to help her, but they're interrupted. They say that they could safely take her to the hospital, but all of a sudden, this guy in a business suit says, I'm her doctor. And he says, give her positive pressure. So James Hall says, well, you never, go against a medical doctor. You could lose your license. And so he says, okay, I'll take off the resuscitator. He takes it off, which was doing its job. And then Greenson pulls a hypodermic syringe with a long heart needle, about a foot long, and fills it with a brownish fluid, which is not adrenaline, by the way. And he says, I got to put this between the blank and blank ribs. And then he just very roughly injects it into her chest, and then it kind of goes at a strange angle. So James Hall says that Greenson just kind of leaned on it and just forced it right into her heart. And at this point, about a minute later, she expires.
There was a sound of like cracking ribs and everything. It was they were treating her like a piece of meat.
Well, let me ask you this.
It was very brutal.
Explain, who is Greenson and how did he wind up on the scene? Who called this doctor to show up?
Okay, Mrs. Murray called Greenson because Norman Jeffries said that Mrs. Murray first called an ambulance, Then she called Greenson, who said he was nearby and he'd be right over. And then Greenson says, call Engelberg. But, here's the thing.
Greenson, sorry.
I know, so one second. Greenson is a psychiatrist to Marilyn Monroe, and he's been treating her. But here's how he gets into the whole picture. His motive is, number one, he's sick and tired of treating her 6 to 7 times a week, all hours of the day. And the thing that put him over the top was that it wasn't really known that he was having an affair with Marilyn. And so Bobby Kennedy found out that, Greenson's having this affair with Marilyn. He calls up the doctor on the last day of her life, according to Peter Lawford, and Peter Lawford says that Bobby lied to Greenson and tricked him into thinking that not only would she go public on Monday morning at this press conference with Bobby and Jack, but Bobby said, she's going to go public with you too, Greenson. And so that frightened him. His whole psychoanalytic career that is absolutely burgeoning, it's going to go to nothing, over this whole thing. And so he decides that, being an egomaniac that he is, Greenson says, well, why shouldn't I do it? And so he's convinced to do it. That puts him right over the top, that his affair could be exposed. But the whole thing is that Marilyn only intended on exposing Bobby and Jack, not Greenson. So Bobby used Greenson to get rid of Marilyn.
And
it's as simple as that.
Greenson is not even a medical doctor. He's a psychiatrist.
That's correct, and that's why he hired Dr. Hyman Engelberg, who was her medical physician. And so, but the whole thing is that his whole career is on the line. And the most important thing about this whole case is the fact that, this was reported in the district attorney's report in 1982, and they say that Hall alleges that he saw somebody who identified himself as her doctor had injected her right in the heart. And so now the case is, do we prove this or we disprove it? And it is absolutely proven to be true, because Hall knew things that nobody else knew. Not only that, but Murray Leibowitz, Hall's partner, told Donald Wolfe in 1993 that yes, Hall is telling the truth about Greenson and the heart needle, and yes, she died in the guest cottage, and yes, I went with him. I interviewed Murray Leibowitz's widow, who's like 98 years old, and she said yes. When we saw it on television, she said that her husband had told her that Hall did go with her husband. So there are a lot of people that try to say that James Hall never went there, and they also try to say that, he was paid for his story when he first gave it. That is not true. I heard a recording on the district attorney's office in August 1982, which was months before he ever went to any newspaper, and he told the same exact account about, someone identifying as her doctor and just injecting it right into her heart.
Hall took a polygraph, right?
He took 14 polygraph tests. He passed every single one. We put one of those 14 polygraphs in my book.
Okay,
we put it right there in our book.
What was the first publication he went to?
He went to the Globe, but this was November 23rd, 1982, and but you have to keep in mind that a lot of people are trying to allege that he made up his story when he went to the newspapers. That's impossible, because there's a recording of the district attorney's office, of him telling his account, the same exact account, in August of 1982. So that's, before November 1982.
What other?
There's a lot of confusion about that in several publications.
What other publication did he go to?
He also went to Hustler,
okay.
Larry Flint. This was in 1986. And his account has remained the same all this time. Okay. In fact, I interviewed Mike Carlson, who was Hall's best friend. I did a first-time interview with him. And he said that Hall told him about Greenson and the heart needle, quote-unquote, days or weeks right after it happened.
Okay.
End quote.
We're coming up to a break.
And he also said that James Hall always talked about the injustice of it all. The fact that, this was just a messed up situation, that her death could not be properly reported in the news. He assumed that people didn't want to report that because at the time, he always reported it as a brownish fluid, which is not adrenaline. But at the time, James Hall said that he was confused because Pat Newcomb is saying, I think she took some pills. So he's being led into thinking it's like an overdose by herself, and that some doctor had come in here and given her adrenaline had failed. That's what he thought until 1982, when he finds out that the autopsy says her stomach is empty, but, she has enough drugs in her to kill 3 people. And how does that work? Because, I interviewed a medical professional, Elias Amador, and he said that you would expect to find undissolved capsules had she swallowed that many pills.
Jay, I got to interrupt because we have a hard break because they play the news on Talk Superstation. But we're with Jay Margolis and Richard Buskin, the authors of Murder of Marilyn Monroe, Case Closed. We'll be right back after this. But real quick, I just want to say I've dealt with Hustler. I've dealt with Larry Flint. And they have a contract that's about 2 inches thick, and they do vet out their stories. And they do give polygraphs before they will publish a story. We'll be right back after these messages.
Mm-hmm.
And now a word from our sponsors. We are listener-sponsored, and we appreciate your donations. If you like the show, please visit OppermanReport.com and click on the donate button. Or you can donate directly through PayPal at OppermanReport@gmail.com. We have Mike Ray of InfinityHomePlans.com. He's the host of Parlay over at CJ Mars Radio, Thursday evenings, 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you need custom home designs, stock plans, or 3D work, he's your one-stop shop for home design and drafting needs. Mike Gray at InfinityHomePlans.com. At InfinityHomePlans.com. If you're looking for essential oils, stop by and check out Essentially Tammy on Facebook. She is Young Living Essential Oils Independent Distributor. Now, these are 100% therapeutic grade oils. They help support the body's natural functions. You can visit her website posted on Essentially Tammy to see the current deals, or email at jocotami, JOCATAMI@yahoo.com, or call 352-239-8546. 352-239-8546. Hey, if you need a private investigator, go to my website, emailrevealer.com. We offer asset searches, locates, skip tracing, adoption investigations, online infidelity investigations. You can recover deleted text messages from a cell phone or trace an email to online dating websites to catch people cheating. That's emailrevealer.com, or you can call 800-572-9762. 800-572-9762, or emailrevealer.com, my PI website. Pacific West Bamboo. It's your premier source for construction and craft-grade bamboo poles. They're announcing their latest project with EcoHead Event Sanitation, making bamboo composting bathrooms and porta potties. Their first display will be at the Lucidity Festival in Santa Ynez, California, April 11th to the 13th. Come by and say hi and see what you can build with bamboo. Contact them for any kind of event planning, display building. If you need construction grade or craft grade bamboo products, call Amanda at 503-839-8126, 503-839-8126, or visit PacificWestBamboo.com, their brand new website. We're also sponsored by the New World Mexican Women. This is a rural Mexican craft women's cooperative. They are traditional makers of fine handcrafted, authentic jewelry. They use beautiful stone mosaics and Pacific blue Abilene inlay. They have a wonderful book of love letters written to their men in the United States, begging them to return to their families in Mexico. But they've written a new book, and it's called, it's about a young girl that falls in love with a rodeo bull rider and runs off with him without telling her family. It's a beautiful love story called Azuquina Part 1, Azuquina to the Rodeo. You can find their books and jewelry by clicking on their banner ad at OppermanReport.com or by Googling New World Mexican Women. You can also promote your business or website right here and have your ad played all over the world 7 days a week by emailing OppermanReport@gmail.com or calling 800-572-9762. We are back. Okay, welcome back to the Opperman Report. I am your host, Private Investigator Ed Opperman. This show is brought to you by Audible.com. You go to audibletrial.com/Opperman Report. Get yourself a free audiobook. Sign up for free. Get a free book tonight. We're here with our guest tonight. By the way, I just got to say that we're getting more reaction to this show tonight, more response to this than we have in a long, long time. We got a lot of people listening out there right now. And good old Jay Margolis just had his coffee tonight, man. He shot out of a cannon with this info you're shooting at us, brother. I'm loving this, man. Thank you very much. Jay Margolis and Richard Buskin, the authors of Murder-of-Marilyn-Monroe, Case Closed. You can get a link to the book on Opperman Report, blogspot.com. And don't forget, guys, to support the show. If you go to the members section, we got a whole bunch of shows on the members section. A lot of new stuff came up this week. I did an interview with Doug Valentine about the Phoenix Project, and we got into a lot of different topics that he hasn't covered before. But tonight we're talking about Marilyn Monroe, and pretty much a really pretty good case is being laid out here. That RFK was there that night, and RFK was heavily involved in this murder.
So something I want to say is that the elephant in the room here, really, that we haven't got to yet, is the power of the Kennedys, right? I mean, it's like, why is this, why has it taken this long? Why is it over 50 years? And it's the power of the Kennedys. I mean, there are still people who are afraid to talk, their reach is very far, and especially back then, there was every reason to keep quiet.
And speaking of the power of the Kennedys, Thomas Noguchi, this guy came out of nowhere.
Yes, exactly. He was just a deputy coroner at the time of Marilyn's death, and he's the head guy 5 years later. He's the coroner of all of Los Angeles County. Alan Abbott, who was the funeral director who arranged for the 6 Pinkerton guards to come to Marilyn's funeral, he was also a pallbearer on Marilyn's casket. And he said that would only make sense if he was promised that position, if Thomas Noguchi was promised that position in exchange for writing the false statement, no needle mark. And that they would give him the head position, the coroner of Los Angeles County.
And pretty much a TV show, like the guy went Hollywood after that, definitely. Yeah, so he had...
and Thomas Noguchi loved Bobby Kennedy very much. His allegiance was not with Marilyn, it was with Bobby Kennedy. In fact, in the Robert Kennedy autopsy, which he also did, Noguchi did like a pitch-perfect autopsy. He respected Robert Kennedy so much that he understood full well that his autopsy supported the position that there were other gunmen behind Kennedy that were shooting him, not Sirhan. And so he did an autopsy that showed that Robert Kennedy was shot near his right ear at point-blank range. This is something that none of the witnesses saw Sirhan do, because Sirhan was facing him the entire time. He got nowhere near the back of his head.
Well, and also, you have to think, too, that if Noguchi did take the fall, he took a dive that night, and now later on, he has to work on the RFK autopsy. He knows what's the stakes are out there. He knows the guys around RFK. He knows he has to do the right thing now because he's in with them. So, of course, he's going to do the right thing for them, at that point.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, but back to the night of the murder. Back to the night of the murder, because we had left off about this guy Hall, who took all these polygraphs, and people try and say, well, he went to the Globe, okay? But even the Globe, these guys, when they're doing stories like this, they do vet their sources. And the National Enquirer has the state, at the time, they had the same law firm, was their libel and slander law firm, that Bill Clinton had for the White House, I've dealt with them too. It's the contract's like 3 inches thick with these people, and you got to get all your ducks in a row, otherwise they don't pay you. Okay, so that night, this guy Dr. Ralph Greenson.
Ralph Greenson, the psychiatrist.
Right. Now, why would they? What is the do they give a reason why they would call a psychiatrist to come to the house that day to when Marilyn's unconscious?
See, as I mentioned before, Bobby lied to Greenson. In fact, Peter Lawford said the following quote. He said, quote, in 1983, 1 year before he died. He said, "Marilyn has got to be silenced," Bobby told Greenson, or something to that effect. Greenson had thus been set up by Bobby to take care of Marilyn, end quote. And so, what's happening here is that Bobby's just lying to Greenson and saying that Marilyn would also expose the affair with Greenson, which is not true. Marilyn was only going to go public with Bobby and Jack.
No, sure, I understand that, but what's the cover story?
To answer your question, why Greenson? Okay, number one, Greenson was very heavily involved in her life. He wasn't just, the psychiatrist who she was seeing several times a week. She'd at one point moved into his home, which totally broke professional ethics. He was acting almost as her Svengali figure. A lot of people around Marilyn were kind of disturbed about his presence. When she wasn't, she was turning up late for work, on her last uncompleted film, Something's Got to Give, and, things reached a kind of crisis point there that they just couldn't continue with her either being absent or late all the time. It was Greenson who was negotiating with the studio. It wasn't her agent, it was Greenson. And so you put that together with the fact that they've got the goods on Greenson. Bobby finds out that Greenson's been having an affair with Marilyn, so now they've got him on the hook. They can use him to do the dirty work. So he's a perfect guy.
Oh, no, I understand. I understand he did the dirty work. And I understand that he was on the hook for RFK and blackmailed him pretty much to go do this job. But my question is, if the housekeeper called up Greenson and invited him over, there must have been a cop who somewhere along the line said to her, well, why did you call Greenson? Why didn't you call a real doctor, a medical doctor?
No, because whenever there was something wrong, Mrs. Murray was always in the habit of calling Greenson. That was just standard operating procedures. Nothing suspicious about that at all. That's just something she was instructed to do in case of an emergency.
Now, Greenson walked around with a medical bag with these heart needles all the time?
No. That was provided by one of those two cops, Archie Case and James Ahern. And, they were all, even Sergeant Marvin Iannone comes into this whole story. You see, look, in fact, the reason Peter Lawford knows that Greenson killed her is because Hall himself asserts that as Ralph Greenson injected her in the heart, Peter Lawford and Sergeant Marvin Iannone entered the guest cottage. So there are a total of 5 eyewitnesses. There's Peter Lawford, according to James Hall, and there's Sergeant Marvin Iannone. Then there's Pat Newcomb, according to James Hall, and he said that she saw the heart needle too. And then there's Murray Leibowitz, his partner, who has since confirmed that James Hall is telling the truth to Donald Wolfe in 1993. And so you have 3 out of those 5 eyewitnesses, James Hall, Peter Lawford, Murray Leibowitz, Pat Newcomb, and Sergeant Marvin Iannone. You got 3 out of the 5 that say that Greenson did it. You got Peter Lawford, you got Murray Leibowitz, and you got James Hall. That's 60% that say that Greenson killed her as a murder.
But in retrospect, what you're saying is right. It's absolutely ludicrous. You've got a psychiatrist turning up with a doctor's briefcase and pulling out this huge syringe with the heart needle already attached. I mean, as if he's walking around with that.
Yeah, just on a hunch, because he runs into these things all the time. It's not like...
And on top of that, there's this detective, Lynn Franklin, at 12:10 a.m., about 4 hours before Greenson officially calls the police. Peter Lawford is driving drunk. He gets pulled over on Olympic and Robertson Boulevard, which is like 7 miles from her house.
Wow.
And it's about 20 minutes after Greenson kills her, and you got in the back seat Bobby Kennedy. In the front seat next to Peter Lawford, you got Ralph Greenson. What is Ralph Greenson, Bobby Kennedy, and Peter Lawford all doing in the same car 20 minutes after Greenson injects her? They've been caught red-handed.
Wait a second. Is there a police report of that?
No, there's not, but he is a very well-decorated officer, Lynn Franklin. And he asserts that he was 40 years old when he pulled these people over.
Okay.
And he said that he didn't know anything about Marilyn Monroe until 4 hours later when, Greenson officially calls the police. So he didn't make the connection between Bobby Kennedy being in Marilyn's neighborhood until hours later. And he identified Greenson from the funeral footage, and he said, yes, that was the man that was next to Lawford, in the car. And Lawford just said, he's just a doctor. He's riding along with us.
Okay, wait a second.
That's how Lawford identified Greenson.
Gotcha. This cop pulls over Peter Lawford because Peter Lawford's drunk. Big surprise there.
He's hysterical because he thinks they're all going to jail.
Can you imagine? Now, did the cop give him a ticket at least? No ticket.
See, the cop said, well, because Bobby Kennedy was in the back seat and because he was on a first-name, basis with Peter Lawford, he called him Pete. He just gave him a warning, and because he told him, he said, well, you would have never gone to downtown Los Angeles. You're going towards downtown Los Angeles, so you would have never made it to the airport because you're going the opposite direction. And then according to Franklin, the officer, he says that Bobby Kennedy snapped at Peter Lawford and said, I told you, stupid. And so they end up turning around, and going the right way. They would have been going the wrong way if it wasn't for Franklin who pointed out the error.
You've got to remember as well, when this cop pulls over the car and he sees Bobby Kennedy in the back, he's not just looking at the president's brother. He's looking at the Attorney General of the United States.
No, I can pick up that gravity, okay?
You don't give a ticket to him,
Right, yeah. But now, and this cop just came forward on his own years later. Is he still alive now today? No.
I believe he is, but I don't believe that he can speak. I think he's got some kind of thing there.
Okay.
But the thing is that this is just really amazing how you got all these people, 20 minutes after Greenson killed her, they got them all in the same car together. That to me is just like, it's mind blowing.
That's a smoking gun, okay? But now if Lawford is drunk,
yes.
What does this tell us? Was this a spontaneous murder? Or could it...
Lawford was an unwilling participant. There were forces greater than him, like Bobby Kennedy, that could not have stopped this from happening, even though he wanted it to. And Peter Lawford, he is quoted as saying, he said, I certainly think Marilyn would have held a press conference. She was determined to gain back her self-esteem. She was unbalanced at the time, and Bobby was determined to shut her up, regardless of the consequences. It was the craziest thing he ever did, and I was crazy enough to let it happen, end quote, from Peter Lawford.
Whoa, where is that quote from? Yeah, go ahead.
While Peter Lawford, obviously was this Hollywood star, he wasn't really an A-list star, but he'd been around for a couple of decades. But in his own way, he was a stargazer himself. He's the brother-in-law of the president, and he's in awe of him. Frank Sinatra had fallen out with Peter Lawford because of how he sided, with the Kennedys when it was decided that Sinatra was bad news to have him around because of his mob ties. So Lawford, in a way, is a kind of spineless creature. That's what author Anthony Summers said back in the mid-'80s. He interviewed Lawford, and he said that himself, that he was a kind of spineless creature who would do the Kennedys' bidding. So, as Jay said, he was way overpowered by, what Bobby wanted to do.
He eventually felt very bad about what happened. He realized what the Kennedys had done to Lawford himself, and he realized what they did to Marilyn. He said, I just got to tell the truth now. And a year later, he dies of, drug addiction and, alcohol addiction. It's a sad story, but I commend Peter Lawford for finally coming out and telling the truth. And his story, Lawford's account, completely corroborates the James Hall, the ambulance attendant, and Murray Leibowitz's assertion that Hall's account is true.
So this quote you have of Peter Lawford, where does that come from?
That comes from David Heyman's 1983 interview with Peter Lawford. You can find the quote on page 540 of his Robert Kennedy biography in 1998.
Oh, my God. Wow, you would think this stinks to high heaven.
Oh, definitely.
Yes.
You see, nobody had all the pieces, and they didn't put it together. You see, our book is the first one to actually juxtapose the ambulance attendant James Hall's account with Peter Lawford's. Nobody ever did that before, so they never saw the connection between the two accounts. I think they absolutely corroborate each other. I think the most important thing about James Hall's account is that he said that as Greenson injected her, Peter Lawford entered the guest cottage along with Sergeant Marvin Iannone, who always worked with the Kennedys. Now, what's important about that is that, people say, well, how does Peter know that Greenson had thus been set up by Bobby to take care of Marilyn? James Hall says he saw it. That's how. So it completely makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, but now the Kennedys, they deny that RFK was even in L.A. that day.
Oh, that's very true, but there are so many eyewitnesses. There's a studio publicist, Frank Neal, saw Bobby Kennedy about 11 a.m. the last day of Marilyn's life, saw him come on the Studio 18 of 20th Century Fox lot and arrived by helicopter, and he went into a car with Peter Lawford in it. And then he was whisked away, and then Ward Wood, who was one of Lawford's neighbors, saw Bobby Kennedy in the afternoon, and he told Anthony Summers, he said, yep, that was definitely Bobby Kennedy. And, so there were several witnesses. There's close to 20 witnesses that saw him that day. So the fact that he denies it is absolutely ludicrous.
Yeah, the neighbors on either side of Marilyn's house saw him that day.
Yeah, Mary W. Goody Coons Barnes, she's a witness. She and her lady friends were playing bridge. She was the hostess, Mary W. Goody Coons Barnes, at 12304, which is right next door to Marilyn, who was at 12305. And so Mary Barnes, along with her friend Elizabeth Pollard, who was another neighbor, they played with two other ladies. In fact, there was a third woman who spoke to photographer George Barris, and George Barris exclusively told me that this elderly woman approached him in 1986 and says, Mr. Barris, I was a neighbor to Marilyn Monroe, and I saw someone who I believe was Bobby Kennedy go into that house with another man. And this is the part where, that Case or Ahern, Archie Case or James Ahern, they were the man with Bobby Kennedy who gave her that injection in the left armpit. That was in the afternoon. That was before the evening. And that at that time they gave her that left armpit injection to calm her down so they can look for her red diary.
Okay,
but as I mentioned before, they went empty-handed and they had to come back in the evening.
But Jay, they showed up there in her house with enemas and with these syringes and with these.
No, Marilyn had an enema because she always used it. It was something that she used daily. Bobby knew this. He knew enough about Marilyn that she took enemas for dietary purposes. Never would she ever use an enema to medicate herself with pills. In fact, medical professionals will say that does not hold up to scrutiny. In fact, they say that Marilyn could not have given herself the enema because she wouldn't have been able to give herself enough of it before she passes out.
Right.
You see, what you got to understand is, on that day, events escalate rapidly. Initially, Bobby goes there just to kind of tell her, the affair is off and she can't keep contacting, him, and she's already been told to stop contacting the White House, and she doesn't want to be snubbed. She doesn't like the treatment here.
Right.
She's not going to let the Kennedys.
Exactly, and don't forget, when people say, "Oh, was there an enema?" I mean, Noguchi told Brown and Barham, biographers Peter Harry Brown and Patty Barham, Thomas Noguchi, the autopsy surgeon on Marilyn Monroe, he told Brown and Barham, he said that she may have died by an enema or a suppository. There's a lot of people in the Facebook Marilyn groups that think that, the formed stool in the autopsy report means that there was no enema. That's nonsense because Noguchi just wrote anything on the autopsy. Right. I don't trust his autopsy to be accurate when it's something like that. There was purplish discoloration of her colon. Medical professionals like Arnold Abrams, who was Donald Spoto's medical professional for his 1993 Marilyn book, Dr. Arnold Abrams said that there was something crazy going on in this woman's colon.
Well,
and Dr. Cyril Wex is trying to say, oh, that just happens because of, when she's died and she had settled. Yeah, right. That is not going to happen just because, of no reason. There has to be an explanation for it. Our reasoning is that she was given an enema. In fact, check this out. Lawford's third wife, Deborah Gould, told Anthony Summers that one time when Peter was a little bit drunk, Deborah Gould said, well, how did Marilyn die? And Peter Lawford says Marilyn took her last big enema.
Oh, really?
That suggests that an enema was used on her.
Well, if she was taking phenobarbital and Seconal, abusing it for years, that causes constipation, so you would need enemas in order to function.
Absolutely,
yeah.
But Dr. John Miner said that a noxious substance such as the barbiturates could account for the purplish discoloration of the colon that he found at the autopsy. He oversaw it with Dr. Noguchi, and he believed that Marilyn was given an enema, but he, with no evidence, said that Mrs. Murray gave Marilyn the enema. There's absolutely no evidence that Mrs. Murray did anything but try to call an ambulance and help her.
And the having to remove the sheets and wash the sheets would be an indication too of an enema.
Oh, definitely. I mean, remember, James Hall said there was no sheet, no blanket when he was there, which is very suspicious. It means that everything was taken off there was a linen closet right down on the guest cottage. Blankets could have very easily dried her off, and she was placed face up when the ambulance men got there. So somebody moved her, wiped her off, and she was nude when the ambulance men got there.
Right, she was nude, right. Which is very unusual.
And that's another ludicrous thing, is that when the cops arrive, Mrs. Murray is doing the washing. It's like, really? Her employer has just died,
right?
And she's doing the washing.
And it's very unusual for a woman to commit suicide nude. They get dressed up for it. They make
that
occasion.
Is very true.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
You don't see that. In fact, there was a friend of Marilyn's, William Trevia, a costume designer, and he said that if Marilyn had committed suicide, she would have dressed up the prettiest self that she ever did, and then she would have killed herself. She wouldn't be looking how horrible she looks in those autopsy pictures.
Yeah, they get their hair done. Women plan this. Now, the other thing, too, is what about a suicide note?
There was no suicide note.
There was no suicide.
No, there was no suicide note.
Now,
I mean, think about this as well. If you see the police file photos of the scene, there's one where you see a cop's hand pointing to the empty pill bottles on Marilyn's bedside table. Every one of those bottles is sort of with the cap screwed back on, and they're in a neat row. Do you really think if she was swallowing all these pills, going to kill herself, that she would take the time to put the caps back on the bottles?
And another good point too is that she didn't even have enough drugs on hand in order to match the levels of drugs that were later found in her blood. Now, she had a Nebutol prescription from Dr. Engelberg July 25th for 25 Nebutols. And then she had a refill one day before she dies on August 3rd, 1962. Now, Ralph Roberts, her best friend, said, well, I know from Mae Reese, her secretary, that Marilyn takes about 6 Nebutols every day.
Wow.
Do you really think that she's going to hold on to those 50 pills from Engelberg and then take 47 of them to match the amount in her blood? That doesn't make any sense for someone who takes pills every day.
Well, also, too, there's studies you can do, too, because if you're taking pills, there's a point where you can't, you pass out. You can't keep taking them if you're taking them one at a time. And you pass
exactly.
out.
She would have passed out before she could have taken them all.
Right, and also, too, if you take them all at once, then you regurgitate. You throw some back up. So
and there was no indication of vomit, according to James Hall.
Oh, really?
That's another point I want to hammer home, is that he said there was no indication of vomit.
Well, that's interesting. Okay. Back to Greenson.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Ralph Greenson. He was also Frank Sinatra's psychiatrist.
He was, and then Frank won an Academy Award from Here to Eternity, and he said, "Goodbye, Greenson, you're done." He felt all his insecurities were over after he won an Oscar.
Well, that's interesting. So Sinatra had a psychiatrist before Here to Eternity.
That is correct, and that was Greenson. Yeah. And then, afterwards, he didn't feel he needed Greenson anymore.
Was there an overlap when he was seeing both Sinatra and Monroe?
Not at that time. He was seeing Frank first.
So Frank first.
She only saw Ralph Greenson only saw Marilyn during the last couple of years of her life.
Wow. Yeah. Well, that's interesting because you can imagine the stories he heard from Sinatra.
Oh, sure. In fact, Greenson really, according to colleagues, he kind of felt like he wanted to immerse himself in this whole Hollywood thing. Like, he got a real, jolly off of just knowing these people. It kind of just gave him this ego,
Well, that's also a kind of part of the sort of backstory, which is a bit ugly as well, which is Marilyn suffered the fate that a lot of, high-profile celebrities have, which is, a lot of people around them all were trying to get their claws into them. And, so in Marilyn's case, you've got Greenson, but you've also got the Strasbergs. A lot of people really didn't like the way that the Strasbergs really had their claws into Marilyn and were draining her of a lot of money. And, Paula Strasberg, Lee Strasberg's estranged wife, was on the set of all the films, coaching her, much to the annoyance of fellow actors and directors. And then you've got Pat Newcomb, the publicist. Some people thought she was, also trying to, weighing with her influence over Marilyn. Everyone's trying to own her and get a piece of her. And for the person at the center of all this, the celebrity, Marilyn Monroe in this case, it's got to be really difficult. They don't know who to trust. They don't know, who's their friend.
And wasn't Strasberg in her will?
That is correct. Yes,
absolutely.
Where did her estate go to? Most of it.
Well, most went to Strasberg out of any one individual. There was part of it went to her half sister Bernice, but she didn't get that money until years later because at the time of her death, Marilyn was trying to pay off all these other people. Like, for example, Norman Jeffries threw in like a bill for like $200 or something, and he had like the.
Uh-oh. Did I lose you?
Hello, Jay?
Yeah, I think we lost Jay.
I think we lost him.
I know, Jay's on a roll, man.
I was going to say Lee Strasberg also delivered the eulogy at Marilyn's funeral.
Oh, really? Okay. Well, you know what? We got to take a break anyway, so let's take a commercial break, and we'll try and get Jay back on the line. Fascinating stuff, man. This is great information. We'll be back. We're here with tonight, the murder of Marilyn Monroe, case closed. Jay Margolis and Richard Buskin. They might have gotten Jay, okay? They might have silenced him tonight and took him out, okay, because we know too much. So everybody watch your back tonight. We got a hot show. All right, let's play this ad. We'll pull in Jay in a minute. And now a word from our sponsors. We are listener-sponsored, and we appreciate your donations. If you like the show, please visit OppermanReport.com and click on the donate button. Or you can donate directly through PayPal at OppermanReport@gmail.com. We have Mike Ray of InfinityHomeplans.com. He's the host of Parlay over at CJ Mars Radio, Thursday evenings at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you need custom home designs, stock plans, or 3D work, he's your one-stop shop for home design and drafting needs. Mike Gray at InfinityHomeplans.com. At InfinityHomeplans.com. If you're looking for essential oils, stop by and check out Essentially Tammy on Facebook. She is Young Living Essential Oils Independent Distributor. These are 100% therapeutic grade oils. They help support the body's natural functions. You can visit her website posted on Essentially Tammy to see the current deals, or email at JockoTammy, JOCATAMI@yahoo.com, or call 352-239-8546. 352-239-8546. Hey, if you need a private investigator, go to my website, emailrevealer.com. We offer asset searches, locates, skip tracing, adoption investigations, online infidelity investigations. We can recover deleted text messages from a cell phone or trace an email to online dating websites to catch people cheating. That's emailrevealer.com, or you can call 800-572-9762. 800-572-9762 for emailrevealer.com, my PI website. Okay. Pacific West Bamboo. It's your premier source for construction and craft-grade bamboo poles. They're announcing their latest project with EcoHead Event Sanitation, making bamboo composting bathrooms and porta potties. Their first display will be at the Lucidity Festival in Santa Ynez, California, April 11th to the 13th. Come by and say hi and see what you can build with bamboo. Contact them for any kind of event planning, display building. If you need construction-grade or craft-grade bamboo products, call Amanda at 503-839-8126, 503-839-8126, or visit PacificWestBamboo.com, their brand new website. We're also sponsored by the New World Mexican Women. This is a rural Mexican craft women's cooperative. They are traditional makers of fine handcrafted, authentic jewelry. They use beautiful stone mosaics and Pacific blue Abilene inlay. They have a wonderful book of love letters written to their men in the United States, begging them to return to their families in Mexico. but they've written a new book, and it's called. It's about a young girl that falls in love with a rodeo bull rider and runs off with him without telling her family. It's a beautiful love story called Azukina Part 1, Azukina to the Rodeo. You can find their books and jewelry by clicking on their banner ad at oppermanreport.com or by Googling New World Mexican Women. You can also promote your business or website right here and have your ad played all over the world 7 days a week by emailing oppermanreport@gmail.com or calling 800-572-9762. Okay, welcome back to the Opperman Report. The show is brought to you by Audible.com. I'm your host, private investigator Ed Opperman. We are back. We found Jay. Jay, while you were gone, we got a call that people saw Bobby Kennedy and Peter Lawford entering your home. Are you okay?
Oh, yeah, I'm definitely okay. Nobody got to me between the time I was gone. Don't worry about that.
Okay, thank God for that. Now, what did you come up with? Okay, because while you were investigating this whole Marilyn Monroe thing, you came up with some information about the RFK assassination as well.
That is correct. In fact, that wasn't in the original manuscript. I did subsequent research that, and I was able to come to the conclusion that on June 5th, 1968, Robert Kennedy was shot twice by a second shooter and fatally wounded by a third shooter, all within 5.5 seconds. Now, I interviewed a man named Don Schulman, and he was a KNXET employee, and he said to me, quote, and he hasn't been interviewed since the 1970s, so you can imagine, first-time interviews since then, that's pretty incredible. And he said to me, quote, he said, one was Sirhan, and the other one was a security guard. All of a sudden, Sirhan was a man who jumped out and yelled obscenities at Kennedy and shot at him, while the guard next to Kennedy pulled his gun and fired. And he said, I went out, and the first person I saw was reporter Jeff Brent, who interviewed me for Continental Radio about 10 to 12 minutes after the shooting. I was interviewed by a lot of people. I saw what I saw. The security guard shot Kennedy. He disappeared for quite some time, end quote. Now, that's the second shooter. You see, the second shooter shot him twice to the right armpit, and then the third shooter, who was the medallion guy, shot him in the back of the head. I did a first-time interview with Irene Gizzi. She was a Youth for Kennedy chairman in Panorama City, and she was only 28 at the time of the shooting. She saw a 5-person group, including this man who we call the third shooter. She called him the medallion guy because he had a big flashy medallion around his neck. He was a Ku Klux Klan terrorist, and his girlfriend was a polka-dot dress girl who was also a Ku Klux Klan terrorist, Kathy Ainsworth. Our book is the first one to actually document that she and her boyfriend were on the scene of any of the Robert Kennedy books ever written. Our book is the first one to actually document it with photo identifications. I gave Miss Gizzi a lineup, and she picked the medallion guy and the polka-dot dress girl, and she wrote medallion above, his picture, and she wrote polka-dot dress above her picture. And she said they were in a 5-person group with 3 other CIA agents. I've been able to determine the 3 men that she saw with these 2 people were CIA agents, George Joannides, David Sanchez Morales, and CIA agent James Hardesty Critchfield, who was the CIA chief in the Middle East at the time that Bobby was shot. Huh. So what is it with these 3 CIA agents with 2 Ku Klux Klan terrorists in a 5-person group? What are they doing shortly before the shooting downstairs in the ambassador room shortly before Kennedy is shot upstairs in the pantry? Very curious thing. And she notated they were together, and she said that they weren't wearing any Kennedy hats or buttons, and it looked totally suspicious. The 3 men, she said, were wearing suits. She said the medallion guy was wearing like a suit, and the polka-dot dress girl was obviously wearing this dress. And so what's fascinating about that is that my book mentions 2 eyewitnesses that saw the medallion guy firing his gun in the pantry. I have since found a 3rd eyewitness who saw the medallion guy firing his gun, and I have also found a 2nd eyewitness next to Don Schulman who saw a 2nd shooter firing his gun. So you have a total of 5 eyewitnesses to people that are not Sirhan shooting a gun in the pantry for a total of 3 fired guns.
How does that connect up to the Marilyn Monroe case, though?
Well, I figured it was kind of interesting how, we did the research to determine that Bobby Kennedy had Marilyn killed, and then we go and turn around and say, well, this is how Bobby died. I definitely think it's interesting to bring it full circle.
Yeah.
We bring everything full circle.
Because, Jay and I actually, discussed this. It was like, okay, is this just totally disconnected? And it isn't. It's the postscript. It's like, okay, here's what the person who was behind Marilyn's murder, here's what, happened to him. And I have to tell you, this book's been getting a lot of attention around the world, initially overseas. I mean, now it's really been picking up momentum in the US, but at the beginning we were getting a lot of attention from Europe and from Australia, the Far East. And while everyone was obviously fascinated with all this stuff about Marilyn, they were also picking up on this RFK story. So it actually, I think people are seeing, the connection.
Jay, are you familiar with the? I thought there was a direct connection. I just assumed. But now, Jay, are you familiar with the connections with Sirhan to the Process Church of the Final Judgment?
Excuse me?
That Sirhan attended orgies and sex parties with these.
I mean, none of that can be validated. I've
never
seen that in any of my research.
I'm going to send you an INS investigative document, a police report from the Immigration National Relations Service that Sirhan attended parties with the Process Church of the Final Judgment. It's a satanic cult.
Well, I mean, he may have done a lot of things on his own free time, but with regards to the Robert Kennedy case, I've never seen any of that mentioned with regards to Bobby's death.
Yeah.
In fact, a lot of people try to focus on Sirhan. They try to say, he was a Manchurian candidate. And yes, this is true. But if you don't see any of that stuff in my book, it's because I wanted to focus on eyewitness testimony. I wanted to focus on the stuff that the court isn't going to say this is a sideshow. And you'll never be able to convince anybody that he was a Manchurian candidate. You see, the CIA, hypno-programmed him, and the polka-dot dress girl, Kathy Ainsworth, was his programmer. And she was the one that smiled at him to go into motion. Sirhan mentioned on the record that there was a girl who gave him coffee. That was the polka-dot dress girl. And she's the one that, made this thing happen. But here's the real clincher. People say, well, how did, the conspirators, the people that really murdered him, how did they get him into the pantry? Well, the security guard, was behind him. The ace security guard behind him admitted that he was holding on to his right elbow with his left hand. He's using his right hand for crowd control. He said he wasn't there to protect Bobby Kennedy. He was just there for crowd control. But he's literally holding on to him moments before, the guard himself pulls his gun and fires. You see, the guard's job was to stun him twice to the right armpit while the real killer, the medallion guy, ran over and went bang. And that's why the security guard said he got powder burns in his eyes. It was not from Sirhan's gun because powder burns only go to the back and sides of the gun. They don't go forward, in order to make, it be Sirhan's gun. That's why Sirhan's gun could not have produced the powder burns that the guard got in his eyes. And a lot of people are saying, well, Caesar, you're ridiculous because you just admitted that you killed Kennedy because you provided the fatal shot. That's an argument. That is wrong. He did not provide the fatal shot. It was the medallion guy who shot him in the back of the head. And so a lot of people have tried to blame it all on the security guard, but that is absolutely wrong. What our book is different is that it brings the medallion guy and the polka-dot dress girl into the game when everybody else was not really focusing on them. The fact that we can identify them now makes everything much more clear.
Are any of those people alive today?
The medallion guy is alive today. He's an alleged born-again Christian. He is a vice president of ministry of the C.S. Lewis Institute. And, our book was accepted into the National Press Club, which is about 7 miles from his church. So it's kind of interesting that, being about 7 miles away from his church, he definitely heard about it, I'm sure. But, we have documentation to prove that this is all true. Again, as I mentioned, I have a third eyewitness who I put under professional forensic hypnotism by someone who's a vice president of the Oregon Hypnotists, a very credible, hypnotist. And so this person who was put under hypnotism picked the medallion guy out of a 6-person photo lineup, picked the polka-dot dress girl out of a 6-person photo lineup, and so this here is something that has never been revealed before, and it's definitely going to change all the literature that comes afterwards on the Bobby Kennedy case.
It's interesting, too, that the Bobby Kennedy crime scene has pretty much been destroyed. Yes.
Another thing to remember is there's actually an audio recording, the Brzezinski recording. Stanislav Brzezinski was a Polish reporter who inadvertently left his recorder on, and Philip Van Prague is a eight for Sirhan, that's 3 for the security guard, because the security guard missed one time. One of the bullets went right harmlessly through Kennedy's suit coat, as documented, and the other 2 went in his right armpit. So that's 3 for the guard, and then there's 2 for the medallion guy. One of his shots went into the ceiling, and then the other shot went into Kennedy's head. So that's a total of 13.
What about Rosie Greer? Have you interviewed him? What does he say about all this?
I have not interviewed him, but as to my understanding, he's got a church himself, and in fact, it's rather close to me. So I do have him on the list.
Yeah, me too.
I am going to interview him.
Yeah, I'm trying to get a hold of him too. Yeah, they don't seem to get back. And it's interesting too that again, like they destroyed the crime scene for RFK. Many of the crime scene, the crime scene photos for Marilyn. And even some of her organs at the autopsy are all gone now.
Yes, that is correct. And in fact, John Miner, who oversaw the autopsy with Dr. Thomas Noguchi, John Miner was the deputy district attorney at the time of Los Angeles County, and he said that he was called on a Sunday, and then all the organs were gone. He said it wouldn't have happened until the following day had it been any other case. I mean, he just said that this is just something that just does not happen unless there's some kind of political influence, going on here. He suspected that Coroner Curfey chose to be very political when he said, quote, Coroner Curfey, who was the coroner, he had to make a public statement on August 18th, 1962, and he made a statement. He says, "It is our opinion that it is a probable suicide." And I interviewed Alan Abbott, who was the funeral director, and he was also the pallbearer to Marilyn's funeral, and he said that Coroner Curfey was just coming up with some kind of political solution. This was just bogus. So he knew that there was something wrong with Noguchi, because Noguchi, he said, kept changing his mind about what he claimed were the circumstances. And then, Coroner Curfey comes in and he makes the statement, but he also said that the deputy coroner, Lionel Grandison, who actually saw Marilyn's diary at the coroner's office, he said that Lionel Grandison actually, was questioning that colon. He said, we don't know what she's died of. She's got this purplish discoloration of her colon. I'm not going to sign it suicide, he said. So Coroner Curfey says, I'm going to threaten you with your job if you don't sign that thing. And so Curfey finally says, well, can you put probable suicide on there? And so Lionel Grandison says, fine, I could go with probable suicide, and that's how that came out. Because even Cyril Wecht, the famous pathologist, who's actually Noguchi's friend, by the way, very good friend, he said he never saw probable suicide in all the thousands of autopsies he's ever done. He said you don't see that. You see undetermined death, you see suicide, murder, homicide, suicide, accident, undetermined, but you don't see probable suicide.
Yeah, I've never heard the word probable before in an autopsy conclusion.
something else I just want to mention when you sort of said about, crime scene.
Yeah.
In our book, we've got two versions of a police file photo of Marilyn's bedroom, on the day she died, or actually the following day, August the 5th. And in the one that was released, that was put out, you just sort of see this kind of, unmade bed and some of her possessions lying around the room. But the version that we got from a confidential source, which is also published in our book, shows this really large smudge on the wall. We're speculating it could be blood. We don't know for sure. It's a black and white photo, but it's obviously suspicious that they airbrushed this out of the photo that was officially released.
What about autopsy photos? Have you seen autopsy photos that could show bruises on her body from being beaten up that night?
Well, there was actually this photo that was face down. It's also in our book, in which there's a bruise on her upper back. But curiously enough, why didn't Dr. Thomas Noguchi actually notate that in his official autopsy? He only notated the one that is on her lower back, not on her upper back, which is clearly seen on the picture of her face down on the bed on page 30 of our book. And what's interesting about that is that, in addition, Dr. Thomas Noguchi told biographers Brown and Barham, he said that there were bruises on the arms. And so he's telling these biographers about bruises that he didn't even notate in the autopsy report. Very curious. So there's the one on the upper back, there's a bruises on the arms, which James Hall said that he was responsible for because he pulled her off the bed to get her onto a hard surface so he could work on her and try to save her life. He said that you don't care about bruises when you're thinking about this, you just got to save the patient.
There is a photo that's been published before. It was in, I think it was first published in Anthony Summers' book Goddess back in 1985, where you do see Marilyn's lifeless body, and her face is sagging, but that's as a result of the work that was done on her.
And there's all the blood in her face, because she was placed face down. They moved her from the guest cottage to the main bedroom, and they laid her face down so that all the blood would pool and disguise any needle marks that were in the left armpit, behind both knees, and the jugular vein in her neck, and of course the one in the heart. You see, the official autopsy noted there was lividity in the chest area, which was right around that heart. So that correlates with that.
Is there anything from this investigation that's sealed?
I believe that of course, there were sealed records. There was Marty George, who was a Los Angeles photographer. I interviewed a confidential source who knew Marty George, and he went every year. He'd go down to the coroner's office and take pictures of everybody. He knew about Marilyn. He was very interested because days after she died, he wanted to see if he could find out the coroner's report. So he went over there, and there was a sealed report. It was sealed, but he figured that sealed coroner's reports are not legal. So he opened it, broke the seal, and he looked at it. And Marty George saw that there were needle marks in the jugular vein in her neck, behind both knees, and he said that there was an empty stomach. And he's asking, my confidential source and saying, well, what does this mean, empty stomach? And my confidential source tells Marty George it means that she couldn't have died by, oral ingestion of barbiturates, because you would expect to find undissolved capsules in the stomach. And so they immediately found it very suspicious, and apparently the report has been altered several times since Marty saw it, and he didn't think to take a picture of it because he was so stunned. So what he did was he just wrapped it and put it back on the seal. But what else was interesting was that he noticed that there was actually a reel, like a reel-to-reel thing that's unusual, that's not usually accompanied with autopsy reports. And so he thought that was a little bit strange, that there was also that, too, with the file.
Okay, guys, we're down to the last 7 minutes, okay? Now, you guys want to go to bed, right, and get rid of me. But the thing is, we're down to the last 7 minutes, and we're going to drop some stations, but we'll still be live on a whole bunch of stations, and there'll be a second YouTube video, too, by the way, that'll go up on YouTube and iHeart and Spreaker. Would you guys like to hang around and take some calls after the hour, or no?
Like a few.
Okay, great.
A few, yeah.
Thank you. Now, but we're going to drop a couple of big stations, okay, at the hour. So sum up and tell us anything you want people to know, and also to where they can find you, where they can find your book, your websites, anything you want to tell them.
Okay, anybody can reach me at Marilyn Monroe 1962 at outlook.com. Marilyn Monroe 1962 at outlook.com if you have any questions. And this book is on Amazon. It's been translated into French, into Italian, and soon to be translated into Russian.
I'm Richard Buskin. You can find me. My website is www.richardbuskin. That's Buskin. richardbuskin.com. And as Jay said, it's actually all the time we're getting more and more translated versions of this publication as interest is spreading around the world.
Now, Jay, you don't have a website?
Not as of yet.
But now you work on a lot of different investigations, right?
Well, the two major ones I've worked on are the one on Marilyn Monroe and Bobby Kennedy's death, and I plan on doing more in the future. But since that's not published material, I can't especially talk about it. Okay, well, you don't have to go into detail. But what other kind of cases are you working on? Well, I'm curious about the John Benet Ramsey case. I think that's very suspicious. I don't want to tell you what my opinion is or anything, because the fact that there are certain members of that household who are very litigation happy. I don't want to mention anything. Tell me about it. Yeah. But it is a very suspicious case. I do not believe an intruder came in there and killed John Benet. I think that's ridiculous. So I could tell you that. Okay, so and any other cases you're working on too? You don't have to go into detail. Well, I've very briefly studied the JFK case. I believe that the man who has confessed to being the Grassy Knoll shooter, his original name is James Sutton. He goes by the name James E. Files, and he's over in an Illinois state penitentiary for shooting 2 Illinois state police officers in a completely unrelated charge. He has been interviewed by FBI agent Zach Shelton, and he finds him credible. He's been interviewed by a number of FBI agents, and they all find him credible. But that's just maybe like a dozen agents. It's not like all of the FBI. They're going to deny it themselves. But these specific agents who decided that they want to find out what happened to Jack Kennedy, they all came together, including Zach Shelton, and they believe that James Files is the Grassy Knoll shooter. And he said that if he had shot, James Files said that if he had shot 1 second later, he would have hit Jackie. That's what he said. He said that it's a good thing that he fired at the time that he did, because it would have been too late, because he did not want to hit Jackie. Interesting. Now, Rich, what other kind of books have you written, Rich, you want to tell people about?
Well, as I said, I've done over 30 books. I've done books on the Beatles, on Elvis Presley, Sheryl Crow. I did the autobiography of Phyllis Diller, comic, a book called Like a Lampshade in a Whorehouse. I've done books on record production. I did the autobiography of Linda and Loretta Sanchez, who are the only sisters to have served simultaneously in the Congress. Lots of stuff, basically. And working at the moment on a book with a Pakistani-American entrepreneur. It's a self-help book.
Ah, very cool, very cool. Okay, we're already getting calls. We're getting a call from Ted Rubenstein, who is a former... he was a researcher with Mae Brussels, and also too with Dave Emery. And in fact, he lived with Dave Emery. He's a real interesting guy. But we'll take his call after in the new section here after the hour. You know what? He's calling in now. Let's bring him in. That's okay. Hey, Ted, how are you, brother?
I'm fine.
Okay, so you're on the air with Jay Margolis and Richard Buskin.
How you doing?
I'm fine.
Hi.
Does the show end at 7 or 8? I mean, does the show go on another hour?
Yeah, you're on the air live right now. We're going to do another hour, and our guests were kind enough to say they'd stay longer. I'll trick them into staying the whole time. Don't worry. Go ahead.
Okay, well, I was wanted to contribute about the discussion about the RFK murder, because I'm kind of out of my depth on the Marilyn Monroe death.
Hey, you know what, Ted? Let's wait till let's take a break, okay? and then we'll have a nice 5-minute break, and we'll restart. We're going to drop a PSN and Talk Superstation, but we'll still be live on all the other stations, and also on Spreaker and iHeartRadio. So our guests tonight, I want to thank these guys so much, man. Really cool guys.
Oh, you're welcome.
Yeah, no, Jay Margolis and Richard Buskin, really, really fascinating. You guys are like an encyclopedia of this case, and I really appreciate that. I love the details, and I really like to make a record of what happened. So we'll be taking a little 5-minute break here. And next week, who do we have coming? Oh, next week I got the FBI agent who investigated the anthrax investigation, and he's now suing the FBI because he thinks that the whole investigation was a big sham and a big hoax. His name is Lambert. Really, you're the guys that love this show. Okay, this is a historic show we have coming on. Yeah, hey Jay, man, you got to listen to the show, Jay. You'll like it. Okay, trust me. Okay, but listen, we're going to take a break.
I love it already.
Thank you, brother. We're going to take a break, and we'll be right back after these messages with more of Jay Margolis, Rich. Buskin, and our good friend Ted Rubenstein. Rubenstein? Okay.
Stein.
Rubenstein. We'll be right back after this.